Hey, come on in. Pull that blanket up. Let your shoulders fall. Let the day go wherever days go when you finally stopped fighting them. Tonight, we're going somewhere different. Not to a town with a water tower and a hardware store and a diner that pours your coffee before you ask. Not to a place that moves slow and quiet and smells like cut grass and something frying on a stove somewhere nearby. Tonight, we are going somewhere the law had not yet reached, somewhere the maps were still being argued over, somewhere the ocean came right up to the edge of everything and the men who lived there had decided that the rules of the civilized world were somebody else's concern. Tonight, we are going to the last American pirate town, Pensacola Bay, the Gulf Coast of Florida, 1820. And before we go, I need you to understand something. This is not the pirate story you have seen in the movies. No costumes, no eyeliner, no cursed gold, and no adventure that feels like a ride you get on and off safely. This is a true story about real men who made real choices in a real place at a real moment in American history when the line between piracy and commerce and war and survival was drawn so faintly that you could stand on it and not know which side you were on. This is the story of a coastline that belonged to whoever was bold enough to hold it, and the men who held it, and what happened when the young United States finally came to take it back. Before we go, I want to ask you something simple. What city are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. I am George the Old Timer, and I read every single one. I want to know how far these stories travel. And if George the Old Timer is part of your evenings, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing. It means everything. Now let the room go dark, and let us go back together. Close your eyes for just a moment. You are standing on a beach that nobody has manicured or developed or put a resort on. A wild beach, the kind that exists before civilization gets to it and decides what it ought to be. White sand so fine it squeaks under your boots. Sea oats bending in a wind that smells like salt and something ancient. Pelicans moving low over the water in formations that look almost military. The Gulf of Mexico stretching south until it becomes the horizon, and the horizon becomes everything. Florida is not yet American. Technically, it is Spanish, has been Spanish for 300 years, give or take. But Spain is exhausted. Its empire is dissolving at the edges the way empires always do when the weight of them gets to be too much for the center to hold. The Spanish governors sit in their forts and issue their proclamations, and they know, in the way that men in their position always know before they are willing to admit it, that what they govern is mostly the idea of governance. The land itself answers to nobody. And this particular stretch of it, this Gulf Coast, these bays and barrier islands and river mouths and mangrove labyrinths running from the Panhandle all the way down to the southern tip of the peninsula, this coast is so vast and so complicated and poorly mapped that even if Spain had the energy to govern it, which it does not, the geography alone would have made the project nearly impossible. The barrier islands sit offshore like a broken chain. Between them and the mainland are sounds and bays of varying depth. Behind those are tidal marshes that extend inland for miles before the ground becomes genuinely dry.
Rivers come out of the interior through the marsh and empty into the bays. Creeks branch off the rivers and branch again and become channels through the marsh grass that narrow to the width of a boat and then open up again into hidden ponds that exist on no official chart. A man who knew this coast could do almost anything in it.
He could run a vessel of shallow draft through channels a naval frigate could not follow. He could vanish into the marsh grass of an estuary and be invisible from 50 yards in any direction. He could move from the Gulf to the interior without ever crossing open water where he might be seen. He could disappear as completely as if the coast had simply swallowed him. The Spanish did not fully know this coast. The Americans who were coming to claim it did not know it either. But there were men who did. Men who had been living on it, working it, learning its tides and its channels and its moods in every season. Men who had come here from somewhere else and found that the coast was a place that rewarded the kind of knowledge that only came from being present in it, from moving through it every day, from making mistakes in it and surviving those mistakes and remembering what they taught you. Those men were here. They had been here for years, and they had no intention of leaving. Into that ungoverned space, into that gap between what the law said and what the land actually was, came the pirates. Not from some far romantic sea, not from the Caribbean of a century before, with its great square-rigged ships and its famous names and its mythology that had already, by 1820, begun to harden into legend. From right here, from the coastline itself, from Americans and former Americans and men who had never been Americans and men who had tried being Americans and found the arrangement unsatisfactory. Many of them had fought in the Revolution, in the War of 1812, in the smaller, less celebrated conflicts that had been running along the frontier of the expanding American Republic since before there was a republic to speak of. They had learned to fight, had learned to shoot and to navigate and to read weather and to manage men under pressure and to make quick decisions in situations where the wrong decision got people killed. And then the fighting stopped, and peacetime America looked at these men and their particular skills and did not know what to do with them. The frontier was one option. Men who could not find a place in the settled East went west and south with the edge of settlement, following the line where the known world ended and the unknown one began. Some of them went to the Gulf Coast for exactly this reason, because the Gulf Coast in 1820 was as much a frontier as anything to the west, ungoverned, unmapped in any useful sense, full of possibility for a man willing to accept the risks that came with the possibility. Some of them were not American at all. The Napoleonic Wars had ended in 1815. 20 years of nearly continuous war across Europe and the wider world had produced a generation of men who were exceptionally skilled at the arts of violence and navigation and had very little to apply those skills to once the peace came. Former officers of the French Navy, former officers of the British Navy, men who had sailed under a dozen different flags in a decade and who had developed loyalties to craft and to profit rather than to any particular nation. They came south, to the place where the rules were still being written, and they wrote their own.
There was a town. That is the part that most people do not know or do not think about when they think about this world. When piracy comes to mind, the image is the ship, the open ocean, men between places, perpetually in motion, anchored to nothing. And there is truth in that image, But a pirate operation of any real size, any operation that was more than one vessel and a handful of desperate men, needed something the ship could not provide: a base. A place to bring the prizes, to unload the cargo and store it and arrange for its sale, to repair the ships and replace the rigging and recaulk the hull and do all the unglamorous maintenance work that kept a vessel seaworthy, to recruit men because the work was dangerous and crews needed replenishing constantly, and men only came if there was a place to come to that offered something besides the ship itself. A place to rest, a place to sleep in something that did not move, to eat food that had not been salted and packed in a barrel 6 months ago, to drink rum in a room instead of on a deck, to be, for a little while, not at sea. The Gulf Coast had several such places in this era. Amelia Island at the northeastern corner of Florida near the Georgia border, Tampa Bay, before Tampa was anything more than a name some people used for the general area, the 10,000 islands in the far south where the mangrove coast was so intricate that a small boat could vanish into it and not be found by anyone without a guide who had been born knowing those waters, and smaller settlements, less famous, less documented, clusters of buildings on particular bays that the people who used them knew by name, but that appeared on no official map, and that the governments of Spain or the United States or anyone else would have had difficulty finding even if they had been looking, which often they were not. Picture one of those settlements. Not the settlement that appears in novels, not the romanticized version with its dramatic characters and its picturesque squalor. The real thing. A clearing at the edge of a bay, cut from the scrub pine and the palmetto with axes by men who needed shelter more than they needed beauty. Buildings constructed from whatever was available. Timber from the Florida interior brought in by the men who knew where to get it, lumber salvaged from prizes, palmetto fronds for roofing until something more permanent could be arranged, a warehouse or the functional equivalent, a structure for storing cargo that could not immediately be moved, bales of cloth, barrels of sugar from Cuban ships, manufactured goods from American or European vessels taken in the Gulf, stores of food and fresh water, coils of rope and spare canvas for the ships, a tavern or what served the purpose, a few more permanent structures for the men who had been here longest, who had arrived years ago and stopped thinking of themselves as passing through, who had made the decision, without perhaps making it consciously, that this bay was where they were going to be. Chickens scratching in the dirt between the buildings, always chickens, a few goats, a kitchen garden where the sandy Florida soil permitted it, a dock extending into the bay where the schooners tied up and where the business of loading and unloading happened in the heat of Florida afternoons. Children playing in the sand. This surprises people when I say it, the pirate settlement as a place with children in it. But of course there were children. Where there are people living in a place over time, there are children. They played in the sand and in the shallows, and they grew up with a knowledge of the sea and its rhythms and the bay and its moods that they absorbed without trying, the way children absorb the world they are placed in, and they would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives wherever they ended up. This was not a lawless hellhole. It was a community, strange, dangerous, built on foundations that the government of the United States found criminal, but a community with everything that word contains, everything it has always contained, the proximity and the dependency and the conflict and the loyalty and the accumulated shared history of people who have been in a place together long enough to know each other completely and to have chosen every day to remain. The water
is the beginning of everything here, and you cannot understand what happened on this coast without understanding the water first. The Gulf of Mexico is not the Atlantic. It is shallower, warmer. Its weather behaves differently. The storms that come out of it, the hurricanes that form in the warm water of the Caribbean and curve north and west into the Gulf, are among the most powerful atmospheric events on Earth. The men who worked this coast lived with the hurricane season as a fundamental condition of their existence, June through November, the months when the sky could go from clear to catastrophic in hours, when a storm could build over the warm water and come ashore with winds that bent the palmetto flat and pushed walls of water 10 feet high across the low coastal land. These men knew hurricanes. They knew how to read the signs, the particular quality of the light in the days before a storm, the way the swell on the Gulf changed, the behavior of the birds, the feel of the air. This was not mysticism. It was the accumulated observational knowledge of people who had survived hurricane seasons on this coast and who had learned, sometimes at terrible cost, what the signs meant and what to do when they appeared. The knowledge kept them alive. The Gulf Coast in fair weather was navigable by people who knew it in a way that gave those people enormous advantages over anyone who did not. The tidal ranges on the Gulf Coast of Florida are small compared to the Atlantic, in some areas less than 2 feet between high and low water. This means the channels and the shoals are relatively consistent. A man who had navigated a particular channel once in a vessel of a given draft knew he could navigate it again. The predictability was valuable. It meant the waters could be learned in a way that waters with extreme tidal variation cannot be, because in those waters, the channel that was safe at high tide is a mudflat at low. The barrier islands created what amounted to an interior highway. A vessel running behind the barrier islands in the sounds and bays between the islands and the mainland was invisible from the open Gulf. It could move along the coast without being seen by anything offshore. It could travel from one settlement to the next, from one bay to the next, entirely hidden from any naval vessel patrolling the Gulf approaches. The naval frigates of the United States in this era drew too much water to follow a schooner into those interior passages. They could patrol the Gulf, they could intercept vessels on the open water, but once a vessel crossed behind the barrier islands, it was in a different world, a world where the pursuing ship could not follow, and where the men being pursued had every advantage that comes from knowing a place completely. The pirates knew this. They had built their entire operation around it.
The vessel of choice on this coast was the schooner, not the great ships of the golden age of piracy, not the massive square-rigged vessels that required hundreds of men and drew 20 feet of water and were suited to the open Atlantic, where their size and firepower were advantages. The schooner was different. 2 masts, fore and aft rigged, meaning the sails ran lengthwise along the vessel rather than across it, which gave the schooner an ability to sail closer to the wind than any square-rigged ship. This matters enormously in practical terms. A square-rigged ship can run well before the wind and can sail across it, but cannot sail efficiently into it. A schooner can work its way to windward in conditions where a square rigger can only wait or run. On the Gulf Coast, where the prevailing winds shifted with the season and the weather, the ability to sail in any direction regardless of the wind was not a luxury. It was a survival requirement. The schooners that worked this coast were typically small, 60 to 100 feet, shallow enough in draft to cross the bars at the passes between the barrier islands, fast enough in a fair wind to outrun anything larger, maneuverable enough to work the tight channels of the inshore waters where a larger vessel would have grounded. They carried guns, typically a few small cannon, enough to persuade an unarmed merchant vessel to stop and receive a boarding party without making a fight of it, not enough to stand against a naval vessel in a serious engagement, which was not the plan anyway. The plan was never to fight the Navy. The plan was to not be found by the Navy. A schooner disappearing behind a barrier island into the inland waters was not going to be found by the Navy. The crews who worked these vessels were small by the standards of the era, 15 men, 20, enough to sail the ship and to board a prize if necessary. Men who were skilled enough that a small crew could handle a vessel that in other contexts might require twice as many. Skill was the asset, not size, not firepower. Skill and knowledge and the particular kind of fearlessness that is the absence of fear, but the long practice of working in conditions where fear is a constant companion and must be managed rather than eliminated. These men worked hard and dangerously and with a physical competence that came from doing the work every day in conditions that punished incompetence immediately and decisively. The romance of it existed only at a distance. Up close, it was wet and violent and exhausting, and it killed men young, and it retired very few of them to anything resembling comfort. But it paid, in a time and place where the alternatives paid considerably less.
The men themselves. Because they deserve to exist as people rather than as a type, rather than as the cartoon that history has sometimes made of them, and that the movies have made more thoroughly still. There was the former naval officer. He had a name, but the name changes depending on which account you read and which part of the coast you are reading about, so take him as a type rather than a specific individual. He might have been British, might have been French, might have been American. The Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812 had created men like him across several nations, men who had entered naval service young, had learned to navigate and to command and to fight at sea, had done those things for years with a proficiency that the service required and that they had genuinely developed, and had then found themselves in a peacetime world that had no institutional home for what they were. He was educated, could read and write in 2 or 3 languages, could navigate by the stars with a sextant, and could also navigate by dead reckoning, by the feel of the water and the wind, and the accumulated sense of where he was relative to where he had been, in conditions where a sextant was useless. Could write a letter, could calculate the value of a cargo and negotiate its sale, could manage men, which is a specific skill that not everyone has, the skill of knowing when to push and when to ease off, and how to keep a group of people with competing interests working toward a shared purpose. He had a code of his own, not the code of the civilization he had left behind, his own, developed over years of operating outside the law in a context where the law was not available to resolve disputes or punish wrongdoing, and where the only available enforcement mechanism was the respect and the fear of the men around him. His code was therefore practical. It was about what was necessary to keep the operation running and the men together. It punished things that threatened those goals and permitted things that did not. He thought about going home occasionally, whatever home meant. He had stopped thinking of it as a real possibility some years back, without making a conscious decision to stop. The possibility had simply faded as the years had passed, and the ties to wherever he had come from had attenuated to the point where going back was less a plan than a fantasy he kept for certain moods. There was the American frontiersman. He had come south from Georgia or Tennessee or the Carolinas. He was part of a pattern that repeated across the history of the early American Republic. Men who moved with the edge of settlement,
who were most comfortable just beyond the boundary of the organized world, who had skills that worked in ungoverned spaces, and who found the settled world constraining in ways they could not always articulate but felt constantly. He had been moving south and west his whole adult life. Each place he stopped had eventually gotten too settled, too many neighbors, too much law, and he moved on. The Gulf Coast in 1820 was far enough out that he had not yet felt the need to move on from it. He was not comfortable in the tavern the way the former naval officer was. He was more comfortable in the swamp, in the mangroves. He could disappear into the Florida interior for weeks and come back with information that nobody else had. Where the fresh water was, which routes through the interior were passable in the wet season, where the Seminole towns were, and which of the Seminole were open to trade and which were not. That knowledge was valuable in ways that went beyond money. It was the knowledge of the land itself, the ungoverned land, the land that was not yet claimed in any practical sense by anyone, and it made him, in this community, indispensable. There was the freed black sailor. This is the part of the story that the versions written for popular consumption have most consistently omitted or minimized, and it is too important to minimize. The pirate communities of the Gulf Coast in this era included men who had been enslaved and had escaped, men who had been born free in the Caribbean or in the northern states or in the maroon communities that had been building themselves in the Florida interior for generations, men who had served on ships, merchant ships or naval ships or privateers, and who had discovered in that service that the ocean offered a version of freedom that the land in the America of 1820 did not. On land in America in 1820, a black man was always in danger of being claimed, of being taken, of being made property regardless of the legal status he believed he held. On the water, and particularly on a vessel that operated outside the law, that machinery had less reach. Some of these were among the most skilled mariners on the coast. They had been sailing since they were young. They knew the Gulf and its moods and its currents. They knew the stars that navigators used. They knew how to trim a sail in a building wind, and how to keep a vessel off a lee shore in a storm, and how to read the color of the water for depth. Some of them held positions of real authority in the operations they were part of. Not equality, not the absence of the prejudice that was as present in these communities as it was everywhere in America in 1820, but authority based on competence, which was the only currency that fully worked out here. And some of them had more competence than anyone around them. Their presence in these communities did not resolve neatly into any story we already know how to tell. What it tells us is that the Gulf Coast pirate settlements were genuinely outside the social order of their time, in ways that went beyond the question of whether stealing cargo from merchant ships was legal. That the people who could not exist within the legal America of 1820, who had been decided about by that America in ways that were unacceptable to them, found each other out here, in this ungoverned space, between the law and the sea.
The economy of the operation was not simply violence on the open water. The violence, the taking of prizes, was one part of it, but the operation was, underneath the violence, a commercial enterprise. It existed to make money, and making money required more than taking cargo. It required selling the cargo, turning what had been seized at sea into the cash that paid the men and maintained the ships and kept the settlement running. The Gulf Coast sat at the center of a geography that made this possible. To the north were the American states. Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia were markets for goods.
The American tariff system of the early 19th century put high duties on imported manufactured goods. A merchant in Savannah who could acquire British textiles or French wine at below-market prices because they had not passed through customs was getting a deal that was worth the moral ambiguity of not asking too many questions about where the goods had come from. Many merchants were willing to not ask. To the south was Cuba. Havana in 1820 was a city of genuine consequence, a Spanish colonial city with money and trade and a sophisticated commercial infrastructure. It was also a city deeply involved in the slave trade, which was by 1820 illegal under American law, though not yet actually stopped, and in the traffic in goods and in people that moved through the Caribbean in ways that official commerce did not fully account for. To the west was New Orleans, the great port, the city where everything moved eventually, where a cargo that could not be sold anywhere respectable could find a buyer on the right street at the right time of day if you knew the right men. The pirates sat at the center of this triangle, and they exploited it. They took vessels on the open Gulf, merchant ships running between American ports and Cuba, or between American ports and each other, or between European ports and American ones. They stripped the cargo. In the better organized operations, they let the crew go, understanding that killing sailors created enemies and created attention and created the kind of pressure from naval authorities that was bad for business. The cargo moved north or west through channels that the pirates controlled and that their buyers in legitimate commerce preferred not to examine. This was, at both ends, a system. The pirate who took the cargo and the merchant in Savannah who bought it were participants in the same economy. The difference was that the merchant slept in a house with a proper address and sat in a pew on Sunday mornings and was never going to be the one standing on a wet deck in a Gulf squall with a decision to make about what happened next. He had outsourced the dangerous part, and he paid accordingly. The tavern was the center of it all. Not the ships, not the bay, the tavern. Because the tavern was where the information lived. Who had taken what prize and where? Which shipping lanes were being actively patrolled by naval vessels out of Pensacola or New Orleans? Which merchant captains were known to carry more than their manifest declared? Which buyers in New Orleans were reliable this season, and which ones had recently developed inconvenient relationships with the authorities that made doing business with them a liability? This was intelligence, practical and valuable, and traded over rum and whatever was being cooked in the back over a fire that never fully went out. Disputes were settled in the tavern, not always loudly. The violence that the popular imagination assigns to every interaction in this world was not the daily texture of it. Violence was expensive in this context. It cost you men, and it cost you reputation, and it created enemies who would find, eventually, their moment to collect. The men who ran the successful operations were not impulsive. They were calculating. They had spent years in an environment that punished impulsivity decisively and rewarded calculation consistently. And the ones who had survived that environment had learned the lesson it was teaching. Shares were argued at the table. Alliances were made and unmade. Men who had sailed together for 3 years and knew each other's competencies and failure points and particular habits of mind sat across from each other and worked out what came next the way any group of people in a shared enterprise works out what came next, with reference to what had worked before and what had not, and what the current situation appeared to require. And between the business, they drank. Rum that was better than you might expect because it came from Cuba, and Cuba knew how to make rum. They played cards with a seriousness that reflected stakes that were always real. They argued. They were probably loud about some of it. They sang. The songs were the songs that sailors everywhere sang in this era, about the sea and about home and about women and about the fundamental unfairness of the world and about what a man was going to do differently when he finally got out of this life, which was always going to happen after just a few more good prizes, after just a little more money, after just one more season on the water. Most of them never got out. The exit from the pirate life in 1820 was not usually retirement. It was capture or death, or simply disappearing into the interior with whatever had been accumulated and hoping that nobody with a reason to find you ever came looking. But they sang about getting out, because that is what people do when they have something to hope for that is probably not going to arrive. They sing about it anyway. And the singing is real, even when the hope is not.
There were women in this settlement, and their story has been made invisible by the histories that came after in a way that I am not willing to let stand. Some of them had come willingly, had followed men they loved, or had attached themselves to men who offered protection in a world where an unattached woman had very limited options, and most of those options were worse than the one in front of her. The calculation was not always romantic. It was sometimes practical, in a very clear-eyed way. A woman in 1820 who found herself in a pirate settlement on the Gulf Coast of Florida had usually arrived there by a road that had not offered many comfortable turns, and she had made the best choice available to her at each point on that road, and this was where the road had led. Some of them had come from the Caribbean, from Cuba, or from the other islands. They brought with them languages and knowledge and ways of understanding the physical world that the settlement absorbed and was changed by. They knew plats that the men from the northern states did not know. They knew how to manage in the Florida heat and the Florida humidity, and the particular difficulties of keeping food from spoiling in a climate that was nothing like the climates the men around them had grown up in. There are accounts, fragments of accounts, travelers who passed through and wrote letters, naval officers who conducted interrogations and filed reports, the occasional document from a legal proceeding in a nearby jurisdiction that captures a piece of the picture. These accounts describe women who ran the domestic economy of the settlement with a competence that was not incidental to the operation, but foundational to it, who managed the food and the household goods and the trade of everyday necessities, and who also, those accounts make clear if you read them carefully, knew exactly what was happening with the ships and the cargo and the money, who tracked what was owed and what was owned, and who had been reliable and who had not, who were, in every practical sense, business partners, without the title, without the legal recognition, without the credit that the histories that came after would assign to the men around them. They cooked on fires in the heat of a Florida summer with the efficiency of people for whom cooking on a fire in a Florida summer was simply what cooking was. They raised children in a place where the future was not guaranteed in a specific way, and they did it with the particular matter-of-fact tenacity that characterizes people who have never had the luxury of fragility. They held it together, the way women have always held the difficult and unofficial places of the world together, quietly, without credit, with a practical intelligence that the men around them depended on completely and acknowledged rarely, and that the histories written afterward have mostly forgotten. Their names are mostly gone. Their work is not. The settlement existed because of it. The Seminole cannot be left out of this, because they were here before any of these other people, and they were here through all of it, and they would be here after the pirates were gone in ways that would define the next 50 years of Florida history more than anything the pirates did.
The Seminole were not a single unified people in the way that the word tribe sometimes implies to modern ears. They were a confederation, a collection of Creek and other peoples who had moved south into Florida over the preceding century, drawn by land and by Spanish colonial policy that had welcomed them as a buffer against the British and then the American settlements to the north. They had also absorbed into their communities people who had escaped from slavery. This is one of the most important and least told facts about the Seminole of this era. Their towns in the Florida interior in 1820 were, as a consequence, among the most genuinely free communities in North America. And in 1820, those communities were watching the Americans come. They had been watching for years. They understood the pattern because they had seen it repeated everywhere the Americans had gone. The Americans moved like water. They filled the available space and then found the edges of that space and pushed past them. They negotiated treaties and then found reasons why the treaties did not mean what the other party had understood them to mean. They brought settlers, and the settlers brought more settlers, and the land that had been agreed to be Indian land became, through a process that was never quite a single dramatic act of taking, but was always somehow accomplished, American land. The Seminole knew what was coming. Their relationship with the pirate settlements on the coast was not simple friendship, it was pragmatic. They traded. The pirates wanted food and fresh water and information about the interior and access to the routes that ran through it. The Seminole wanted manufactured goods, metal tools, guns, and the intelligence that men working the shipping lanes could provide about what the American military was doing and where it was doing it. They were not allies in any formal sense. They were neighbors in a dangerous neighborhood who had correctly identified that they were facing versions of the same problem and that the practical exchange of things each possessed and the other needed was in both their interests. When the pressure came, when the Americans moved in earnest, they found themselves on the same side of that line. And what happened to them on that side of that line is one of the darker chapters in American history.
Andrew Jackson arrived in Florida the way a storm arrives. Not all at once, not announced clearly in advance as what it was. First, the distant signs of it, the change in the political weather, the shift in the quality of the light, and then the thing itself, moving faster than you had expected, with more force than you had fully prepared for. Jackson, in 1818 and into the early 1820s, was not yet president. He was a general, the most famous general in America, the hero of New Orleans, the man who had beaten the British in January of 1815 in a battle so lopsided and so decisive that it had made him a legend while he was still young enough to feel what that meant. He also had an understanding of Florida that was simple, direct, and entirely representative of how the American government, whatever it said officially, actually thought about the situation. Florida was going to be American. Everything that was happening in Florida that was not American was therefore a problem to be solved. The Adams-Onis Treaty, negotiated through 1819 and ratified in 1821, formalized the transfer of Florida from Spain to the United States. Spain acknowledged what it had known for years, that it could not hold Florida, that the fiction of Spanish governance in a territory where Spanish authority did not actually extend beyond the walls of a few forts was costing more than it was worth. The paper transfer was one thing, the reality on the ground was another. The reality on the ground was that the Gulf Coast was full of people who had built their lives in the space between the laws, and who had not consulted any treaty about their plans. Jackson moved south before the paperwork was complete. He behaved as though the transfer had already happened. He attacked Seminole settlements. He destroyed towns. He captured Spanish forts on the grounds that the Spanish were allowing the territory to be used as a base for activities hostile to American interests, which was arguably true, but was not a basis for military action that any international lawyer would have found solid. He executed 2 British subjects he had captured on the grounds that they had been inciting the Seminole against American expansion. The British government protested. Jackson ignored the protest. The Monroe administration in Washington issued statements of official concern and privately understood that Jackson was doing what needed to be done in a way that spared everyone in Washington the discomfort of having ordered it in writing. This is how the edges of empires get cleaned up, not through grand policy speeches, through one man on the ground who understands what the policy actually is, regardless of what it says on paper, and who is willing to act on that understanding with a decisiveness that the men who set the policy cannot afford to display publicly. Jackson was that man, and his campaigns through Florida in this period made clear to everyone living on the Gulf Coast that the world they had built in the space between the laws was ending. The space was closing. The Americans were here.
The Navy was given the specific mission of clearing the Gulf Coast of piracy in the early 1820s. It was not a quick operation or a clean one. The officers who received the mission understood its difficulty from the beginning. The coast was vast. The men they were looking for knew it completely, and the Navy's officers did not. The vessels that worked the inland passages were too shallow in draft for a naval frigate to follow. The settlements were not marked on any chart. The men who could have pointed to their locations on a map had every reason not to. They pursued into the bays and behind the barrier islands and toward the river mouths where the channel markers ran out and the depth soundings on the charts became a question mark. Naval officers who had been trained on the open ocean, who understood the geometry of fleet engagements on deep water, found themselves navigating shallow coastal channels in unfamiliar territory, being told that the men they were looking for were somewhere in the marsh grass and the mangroves ahead. Some of the pirates were caught. The ones who were caught were tried, some in New Orleans, some in other American ports. The trials were public, and the sentences in the more serious cases were severe, and the executions that followed were conducted publicly, because the public nature of them was the point. The new order was demonstrating itself, showing what it was willing to do, making clear that the space between the laws had not simply moved, it had been closed. Some escaped, went to Cuba, went to the Caribbean, found other ungoverned spaces in other parts of a world that still had them in sufficient quantity if you knew where to look and were willing to accept the risks that came with living in them. Some simply stopped, became fishermen, became traders of the legal kind, married and settled in the small coastal communities that were beginning to form as Florida became genuinely American, carried the knowledge of the coast into a new way of using it. The knowledge of the channels and the tides and the passes between the barrier islands did not become less valuable because piracy had been suppressed. It became the knowledge of the fishermen and the pilots and the men who ran goods legally between the Gulf ports. The knowledge stayed. The use of it changed. The settlements dissolved. Gradually, the way things dissolve when the conditions that made them possible no longer exist. Not all at once. First, the men who were most exposed left or were taken. Then the operations that had depended on them contracted. The warehouses emptied. The tavern became something else or closed entirely. The buildings were not maintained because no one was there to maintain them, and the Florida vegetation, which is not patient about reclaiming what has been cleared, came back. The palmetto, the sea grape, the mangrove at the water's edge. They grew back over the clearings. The dock rotted and fell into the bay. The paths through the scrub that had been worn clear by years of foot traffic grew over and became indistinguishable from the surrounding vegetation. Within a generation, you could stand where the settlement had been and see almost nothing to tell you that anything had ever been there. The sand covered the traces. The water covered the rest.
But something always remained. The stories remained, in families, in the particular way that people passed down things they were not entirely certain they should be proud of, and not entirely certain they should be ashamed of. In fragments, in the versions that changed with each telling until the names were wrong and the details were blurred, but the shape of the thing was still there. In the names on the landscape, a bay, a creek, a point of land, named for men whose full history nobody in the county remembered anymore, but whose name had stuck to the geography in the way that names do when they have been used long enough. The knowledge remained, the specific and detailed knowledge of that coast, the channels and the sandbars and the tidal patterns and the passes between the islands. It passed from the men who had used it for one purpose to the men who used it for another. The fishermen, the smugglers who continued their work more quietly without the accompanying violence that had made the earlier operations so visible. The pilots who guided larger vessels through the passes. They learned from men who had learned from men who had learned it in a context that was not discussed in polite company. The coast remembered what it knew, even when the people on it had changed. And the shape of the thing remained. The Gulf Coast of Florida in 1820 was the last place in the continental United States where a person could be genuinely outside the law, not as a fugitive, not as a runaway, not as someone hiding from something that was actively pursuing them, but as a person living in a place where the law simply had not arrived yet, where the space between what one government claimed and another government claimed and what was actually happening on the ground was wide enough to build a life in. That kind of space does not exist anymore, not in the continental United States, not in the way it existed then. The country grew into its edges. The law followed settlement. The Navy got bigger, and the government got stronger, and the geography that had protected these people became simply the geography of a state, a proper state, with proper courts and proper laws and proper institutions that told you clearly which side of the line you were on. Florida, the 27th, 1845. The pirates were a story by then, something that had happened before things were settled, something from the time before. What this story is really about is the edges. What happens at the edges of things?
at the edges of empires and legal systems and the organized world as that world defines itself in any particular era. People have always found their way to the edges, not always because they were criminals, sometimes because the center had made a decision about them that they were not willing to accept, because the legal world had determined what they were, and that determination was wrong, or was unacceptable, or simply did not leave room for the kind of person they were, because the options inside the law were worse than the options outside it in ways that a person in a comfortable position might not understand, but that the person making the choice understood completely. Because they needed a horizon, and the settled places had run out of them. The Gulf Coast in 1820 was an edge, and the people who built their lives there were edge people. And edge people make things. They build communities in the spaces that the organized world has not yet claimed. They develop loyalties that are fiercer than the loyalties of settled people, because their loyalty is all they have. There is no institution behind it, no law protecting it, just the understanding between people who are depending on each other completely in a place where that dependency is the only available foundation. The former naval officer who had been sailing under flags of convenience for 15 years, and the Georgia frontiersman who had been following the edge of settlement his whole life, and the freed black sailor who had found on the water the only version of freedom available to him in America in 1820, and the woman from Cuba who had made her own calculations and her own choices and had ended up on this bay. They were not the same. They did not pretend to be the same. The prejudices and the hierarchies that existed in the wider world existed here too, in modified forms, because people carry what they have been shaped by into every new context they enter. But they were here, together, in this place, depending on each other in the specific and practical way of people who understand that the depending is not optional. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, among the oldest and most human things there is. One more time, come back to the bay. Early morning, 1820. Before the heat has built and before the day has made any demands on anyone. The Gulf is flat, pewter-colored in the early light. The pelicans are moving low over the water in that ancient, patient way of theirs, scanning the surface, unhurried, entirely present in the moment of what they are doing. A man is standing at the edge of the settlement. He has been here for 7 years. He came from somewhere else, and he does not think about where that is much anymore. The somewhere else has become abstract, a set of memories that he handles less frequently as the years pass, and that are becoming, in the way of things not regularly used, slightly unfamiliar to him. He is not sure he could go back to being the person who lived in that somewhere else, even if he wanted to. He is not sure he wants to. This is where he is. This bay, these men, this work. He knows what is coming. The news has reached them. The treaty is being signed. The Navy is getting serious. The space between the laws is closing, and he has lived in that space long enough to understand that a man who has built his entire life there needs to start thinking concretely about what happens when it closes. He does not know yet what happens next. What he knows is the water, the way the light comes across the bay in the morning at this hour, the channel that runs along the western edge of the bay where the water is deep enough to bring a loaded schooner in at any tide,
the pass between the two barrier islands to the south, and how it behaves in a following sea versus a head sea, and what draft of vessel can cross it on a falling tide versus a making one. He knows the men, which ones will hold when the pressure comes, and which ones will scatter, which ones are genuinely skilled, and which ones have been concealing the limits of their skill behind the confidence that this life requires you to project regardless of what you actually feel. He knows he has done things he cannot fully account for. He does not spend much time on that. He is standing at the edge of the water in the early morning light, and the pelicans are moving past him on their way to wherever pelicans go, and the bay is doing what the bay has always done, holding its own counsel. The day is coming. It is coming with everything it contains. He stands there for a moment longer, and then he turns and goes back to the work. Because that is what you do when the life you have built is the only life available to you. You go back to the work. Let that settle now. Let the bay go quiet. Let the morning light come up slowly over the Gulf, the way it does when nobody is watching it and it can take its time. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. The water is still out there. The channel is still where it always was. The pelicans are still making their passes over the flat, pewter surface of the Gulf in the early light. And somewhere in the marsh grass at the edge of a bay in Florida, the past is still breathing, quiet, patient, entirely itself. George, the old-timer, will be right here when you come back. Good night.